Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees and here are today's top stories. China imposes sanctions on the UK in retaliation to the UK's sanction on Communist Party's officials. Stay local rules in Wales will end from Saturday, and the Commons voted to keep emergency virus legal measures for another 6 months. Beijing imposes sanctions on 9 UK citizens, including 5 MPs. It comes in retaliation to the UK announcing sanctions for alleged human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims. Here's NTD's Jane Wall with the details.
Among those sanctioned by Beijing is former Conservative leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith. The Chinese regime accused him and others of what it calls maliciously spreading lies and disinformation. In reaction, he says he'll wear it as a badge of honour. It comes days after the UK, together with the US, Canada and the EU, announced sanctions on Chinese officials and a construction company over human rights abuses of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
We will not be deterred from speaking up and taking action like this to hold those responsible for those human rights violations to account.
The Chinese regime sanctioned 9 individuals in the UK, politicians, scholars and human rights activists, and 4 organisations. They'll be barred from going to China and from having financial transactions with Chinese citizens and institutions. On the sanctions list is Baroness Kennedy, director of the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights, who we spoke to earlier.
I don't have a holiday home in China, and nor do I have interests in commercial enterprises in China. So for me personally, it will not have very real consequences. I'm basing my criticism of what is happening in this part of China on evidence, and it's my view that there are serious human rights abuses taking place, and indeed that they point towards a genocide in progress. Now, one of the things is that this is not about China or the Chinese people. This is about the Chinese government taking these steps. And so I would be doing exactly the same thing were it happening in any other country in the world. We have a duty under the Genocide Convention to protect people from genocide, and you don't wait until it's over. You have to act while you think it might be taking place.
Benedict Rogers, Vice Chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, one of the sanctioned organisations, says it's a symbolic reaction.
For me personally, this is simply a symbolic initiative. And it's really a badge of honour that I take as a recognition of my human rights work. I think the regime is reacting not because it has any credibility on its side, but because it doesn't like the truth being exposed and a light being shone on the human rights situation, and so it's lashing out in response to that.
The China Research Group, led by MPs Tom Tugendhat and Neil O'Brien, all of whom have been sanctioned, said in a statement, "It is telling that China now responds to even moderate criticism with sanctions, rather than attempting to defend its actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang." The other sanctioned peer, Lord David Alton, said, "British parliamentarians will go on speaking truth to power and truth to tyranny, using their freedoms and raising their voices on behalf of those who are denied such rights and privileges." Speaking to Times Radio, the Housing Minister, Robert Jenrick, said it's completely wrong for China to place these restrictions on members of our parliament. Boris Johnson said on Twitter that he firmly stands by those sanctioned. The Chinese embassy in the UK didn't immediately respond to our request for comment. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
British fashion brand Burberry is suffering a backlash in China. The company is a member of an organisation that has stopped sourcing cotton from China's Xinjiang region.
Clothing retailer Burberry has become the latest mass-market brand to face a backlash in China over Xinjiang. Award-winning Chinese actress Zhou Dongyu on Thursday terminated her brand ambassador contract with the company. Her agency says the reason is Burberry has not clearly and publicly stated its stance on cotton from Xinjiang. Burberry is a member of the Better Cotton Initiative, a group that promotes sustainable cotton production. The group said last year it was suspending its approval of cotton sourced from China's Xinjiang region, citing human rights concerns. Activists and UN rights experts have accused the Chinese regime of using mass detainment, torture, forced labour and sterilizations on the Uyghur ethnic group. The Chinese regime says its actions in the Western region are necessary to counter extremism. Some Chinese shoppers say they will stop buying from Burberry. In a letter to the UK lawmakers in November, Burberry said it did not have any operations in Xinjiang or work with any suppliers based there. The UK government announced in January that British companies doing business in China will face fines if they cannot prove their products aren't linked to forced labour in Xinjiang.
Scotland joins England and Wales in making organ donation consent automatic. Under the new law, it's presumed you give consent to donating your organs as long as you are aged over 16. Some other exemptions apply. Those who opt out must register their decision on the Organ Donation Scotland website. Scottish Government hopes the new law can increase the number of potential donors. The move follows a similar law brought in England last year. Wales was the first to adopt the opt-out system as opposed to the opt-in system back in 2015. And in other news, following Brexit, the UK doesn't have the same level of access to EU security data. A Lords committee found this means a significant gap in terms of lost capability.
The UK lost access to crucial data on criminals and missing persons as a result of Brexit. That's the finding of a new report published on Friday by a Lords subcommittee. It looks at how last year's Brexit deal with the EU impacts policing, law enforcement and security. The committee welcomes the continued cooperation between the UK and the EU, such as the UK's ongoing access to EU databases covering fingerprints, DNA and criminal records. The report also raises some concerns. Subcommittee Chair Lord Ricketts calls the arrangements complex and untested. He said they largely depend on the level of cooperation between police forces. And the committee finds the biggest impact will be the UK's loss of access to the Schengen Information System. Before Britain left the bloc, the database provided UK police with real-time information about the movement of criminals, missing persons and objects of interest. Lord Ricketts writes on Twitter, UK police checked this 600 million times in 2019. Plan B is an Interpol system, but we depend on EU police to upload their alerts to the system too, and it is slower to reach frontline police here. The report also cautions that arrangements could be terminated if the UK doesn't abide by the EU's strict data protections laws.
The Welsh Government announced today its Stay Local rule will end tomorrow, while travel restrictions within Wales will be lifted. Cross-border movement still isn't allowed without a good reason. 6 people, not including children under 11, from 2 different households will be able to meet outdoors. And outdoor sports for under 18-year-olds will resume. Libraries and hotels will reopen, meaning Wales is moving from Alert Level 4 to Alert 3. On April the 12th, more lifting of restrictions is expected. Avon and Somerset police released new footage from the riot on Sunday night. They are calling for the public to help identify a man who tried to set fire to a police van. The footage released by police shows the moment the man placed a lit item under a police van, while a police officer was still inside. The officer said he placed his van in front of the rioters as they threw glass bottles, rocks as big as fists, pallets and fences at the officers. Police say they received more than 200 calls and nearly 300 submissions of evidence. Still to come, experts say it could take weeks to clear the chaos caused by a supersized cargo ship stuck on the Suez Canal. That and more when we return. There's still chaos in Egypt as the Suez Canal remains blocked. 3 days ago, a skyscraper-sized ship got stuck there and it's still not freed. But experts say it could take weeks to clear. NTD's Colin Fredrickson has more.
One of the largest cargo ships in the world, the quarter-mile-long Ever Given, is wedged sideways across the Suez Canal, blocking several dozen vessels. The ship's Japanese owner issued a written apology, saying they're determined to resolve the situation as soon as possible. It's unclear how long it'll take to free.
There needs to be a time taken to figure out what's the salvage opportunity. In other words, what resources are needed in order to remedy the situation.
Oil-wise, most of the world isn't impacted. Asian countries dependent on Middle Eastern oil don't use the canal. And if you're in North America, on the other side of the world, not much at all. But
if you're European, it has a big impact because a lot of Middle Eastern oil comes through the Suez Canal.
The event questions the reliability of the canal and whether changes need to be made.
But frankly, there's no better alternative than the Suez Canal. The question is, can the Suez Canal be made more reliable than it has been? And it's been pretty reliable. So it's not like we write it off and start over again.
At least 150 other ships are waiting to get through. The canal carries about 12% of world trade each year.
The cheapest and the fastest route, and that's the Suez Canal for all these goods coming from East Asia.
Experts say the 224,000-ton ship could take weeks to refloat.
If it is several weeks or even more, yeah, sure, that will have a big impact, but also on any other port in northwestern Europe for that matter.
Workers are still struggling to free the ship. Colin Fredrickson, NTD News.
So why is the Suez Canal so important? We take a look at what makes it critical to global supply chains.
The Suez Canal is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. About 12% of world trade by volume passes through the man-made channel connecting Europe and Asia. So, a traffic jam like the one caused by the 224,000-ton Ever Given container ship is rather a big problem. Nearly 19,000 ships passed through the canal during 2020. That's an average of 51.5 ships per day. All that traffic adds up to about 1.17 billion tons, all squeezing through the man-made channel. Giant tankers and container ships carry everything from crude oil and refined products to finished goods like electronics and toys. The 120-mile-long canal separates the African continent from Asia. It also provides the shortest sea link between Asia and Europe and the lands lying around the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans.
The heads of Google, Facebook and Twitter testified in front of US Congress on Thursday in a virtual hearing. This is the second time in 5 months that Congress is calling on them to speak. NTD's Christina Kim has more on the hearing.
The virtual hearing focused on social media's role in, quote, promoting extremism and misinformation. Lawmakers grilled the heads of Google, Facebook, and Twitter on a number of topics including censorship, spreading misinformation, and social media's addictive nature and impact on children's mental health.
Your business model itself has become the problem, and the time for self-regulation is over. It's time we legislate to hold you accountable. That's what we're going to do.
Some lawmakers said the platforms encouraged extremism and played a role in the January 6th Capitol breach. Others spoke out against social media censorship of conservative voices, calling it un-American. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg spoke about the censorship, particularly of elected leaders.
Many people are concerned that platforms can ban elected leaders. I am too. I don't think that private companies should make so many decisions like this alone. We need an accountable process, which is why we created an independent oversight board that can overrule our decisions.
But he did not agree that social media is responsible for dividing the nation.
I believe that the division we see today is primarily the result of a political and media environment that drives Americans apart. And we need to reckon with that if we're going to make progress.
Twitter's Jack Dorsey spoke out against too much government regulation, saying it reduces innovation and choice.
If instead we woke up tomorrow and decided to ask the government to tell us what content to take down or leave up, we may end up with a service that couldn't be used to question the government.
Though he admits blocking the New York Post story on Hunter Biden was a mistake. Google CEO Sundar Pichai defended the need for Section 230.
Our ability to provide a range of information and viewpoints, while also being able to remove misinformation, is possible only because of legal frameworks like Section 230.
And lawmakers lambasted the tech giants for social media's negative impact on children and mental health. Zuckerberg said those claims are inconclusive and staying connected is a broadly positive thing. As for Facebook's plan to create an Instagram for kids under 13, Zuckerberg said they haven't worked through the details yet, but thinks it will be important for parents to be able to monitor. Christina Kim, NTD News.
Facebook-owned apps have been used in over half of all online child sex crimes between October 2019 and October 2020. The data was gathered from 35 police forces in England, Wales and the Channel Islands and released by the children's charity NSPCC. Of the Facebook-owned apps, Instagram accounted for the biggest proportion, and crimes of this nature involving the app have risen by 50% on the year before. Facebook plans to encrypt messages across its Instagram and Facebook Messenger apps. The NSPCC has provided repeated warnings against the move, saying it would give offenders a place to hide in the shadows and risks making itself a one-stop grooming shop. Some people say targeting Chinese officials with sanctions is an effective tool in countering the Chinese regime and its abuses. But experts at a recent US Congress hearing argued the real battleground lies in capital and technology. NTD's Penny Joel reports.
The movement to push back against China's human rights abuses has been gaining traction. Both the US and Europe have sanctioned responsible Chinese officials, but Chinese state media say the penalties aren't hitting China where it hurts. They argue sanctions are more symbolic. Despite tensions between US and China, Chinese companies reaped over $10 billion of investment last year through initial public offering in the US. That's the most in 6 years. US capital is the Chinese Communist Party's lifeline. At a recent Congress hearing, experts argued that U.S. investment and technology continue to advance China's military, and current policies aren't fixing the problem.
We need to acknowledge the reality that our business dealings with China have fueled the country's military-industrial complex for the last 40 years. Even business dealings where we service Chinese industries' demand in low technology, commodity sectors haven't been benign, but rather have created opportunities for the Chinese economy to shift resources away from low-tech enterprises to higher-tech sectors to accelerate its indigenization. Maintaining the status quo cannot be our strategy going forward.
Former President Trump issued an executive order to ban Americans from investing in Chinese military companies. But that may not be enough. That's because many Chinese companies may be backed by the military, but you won't be able to find on-paper links connecting them. And in China, the line between state and business is extremely blurry.
So much of the innovations that fuel military capabilities come from the commercial sectors.
The amount of American money heading to China is staggering. According to a recent analysis by the Commerce Department, U.S. public and private equity investments in Chinese companies totaled $2.3 trillion in market value from 1992 to 2020. That could pay the bill for China's military spending in 2019 1,000 times. Over $150 billion of that funding went to companies owned by the Chinese regime, and more than $50 billion were handed to companies directly linked to the military. Penny Joel, NTD News.
America's top diplomat is telling European allies that the West needs to cooperate more than ever. That's how they can deal with challenges coming from the Chinese regime.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is emphasizing the importance of cooperation between the U.S. and its allies. When he visited the NATO headquarters in Belgium on Thursday, Blinken said it's more important than ever for the U.S. and its allies to work together to outcompete China on any playing field.
I came here very much with one particular focus in mind, and that was to make clear the United States' determination to revitalize our alliances and partnerships, to re-engage strongly in them and to work closely with our allies and partners.
Blinken accuses Beijing of undermining the international trading order that the U.S. and its allies built after World War II. He says, quote, "They are actively working to undercut the rules of the international system and the values we and our allies share." NATO's Secretary General agrees that if NATO countries are united, the EU, NATO, and their allies are well positioned to address the rising challenge of communist China. However, Blinken also says the U.S. won't force its allies to choose between U.S. and Beijing.
But that doesn't mean that countries can't work with China where possible. For example, on challenges like climate change, and health security.
Last week, Blinken visited the country's Asian allies, Japan and South Korea. The two countries also support the joint response to challenge from Beijing.
Ford will stop making its Mondeo in Europe as it shifts its manufacturing strategy. It says production will end at its Valencia factory next year. About 5 million Mondeos have been sold since its release in 1993. Demand has switched to sports utility vehicles, or SUVs, over sedan models. Ford has almost doubled its electrification budget to £16 billion last month. From late next year, manufacturing at its Valencia plant will switch to making battery packs for electric and hybrid cars. A 98-year-old woman in France and a 20-year-old student living in his parents' house in England have struck up an unlikely friendship during lockdown, one that the pair hope to continue as restrictions ease.
Lockdowns have upended lives across the world. But for 98-year-old Frenchwoman Jacqueline Tolu and 20-year-old British student Elliot Bellman, the global health crisis has also created an unlikely friendship. Tolu has endured isolation in her care home near Paris due to restricted visitors, while Bellman's plans to visit France this year as part of his studies were quashed by lockdown measures. For 6 months now, the pair have been chatting weekly over Skype, brought together by a scheme called Share a Me that pairs elderly people with language students.
When I was asked if I would like to be linked up with another person, boy or girl, who wants to improve their French through conversation, I accepted, as it would bring me great pleasure.
The opportunity alleviated Tolu's loneliness and brought Bellman, a third-year Warwick University student, an opportunity to practice his French. But the pair also really hit it off.
I was nervous, just meeting a new person, completely different generation, different culture, different language, obviously. So it's nerve-wracking. I'm thinking about maybe we don't get on, maybe she doesn't like me, maybe just like that generational gap would be too much. But as soon as I started talking to her, she's very easy to talk to, she's very funny, she just keeps the conversations going so easily. So this is my room.
Every Monday, Bellman dials in from his parents' home in southern England, Tolu from her wheelchair at the care home in Bonnay-sur-Marne. This time, Tolu told of her experience living through the 1944 Allied D-Day invasion on the Normandy landing beaches.
Thinking back, oh my goodness, how did I manage to live through that? I was so scared.
Tolu said their chats give her a mental escape from the confines of the care home for a little while every week.
That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Lees.